I'm glad to be following Larry speaking at the People's Power Assembly street meeting, which was in front of CNN and as the G20 meeting was taking place. But especially this point, we remember 9/11. We've seen this before. Because tonight what we wanted to do was have a discussion about where we are and what we've seen before, and also what's new and even more dangerous, more extreme, more ominous, that we need to really wrap our head around. Now, I had one kind of report yesterday, and then I'm watching the news last night, and on came the news of Trump, who would implement a national database for Muslim people in the U.S., of all Muslims, and ID cards. And this is CNN headlines this morning. Trump would, quote, certainly implement a national database for U.S. Muslims. NBC News, Trump's plan for a Muslim database draws comparisons to Nazi Germany, and it certainly should. It absolutely should. On BBC News, and it was international coverage, Donald Trump, quote, not opposed to a Muslim database in the U.S. So this was international news. It was news all across the U.S. It wasn't just Trump making a comment at a campaign speech. See, when the U.S. media highlights something, they're putting it out there as a test balloon. And when they show what happened with the Japanese internment camps, as they're talking about what the dangers of a Muslim database are, we should take that very, very seriously. I mean, it really made me forget everything else I was going to say tonight, because I think we have to take it absolutely that seriously. Because Trump may be an extreme racist, he absolutely is, but he is speaking for a real section of the U.S. ruling class. He's not only personally a billionaire, but his voice in the media is accelerated and exacerbated 1,000 times. Now, on the same day, the U.S. Congress, the House voted to block Syrian refugees with enough votes, despite enough votes to overcome a White House veto. Now, the number of Syrian refugees who were coming was so infinitesimally small, 10,000 out of about 12 million. So it's about 1/10% of the Syrian who've been made homeless by U.S. war. But nevertheless, the vote is an attack on all the very people who've been targeted, made targets in the war. Suddenly, they are the ones who are responsible, supposedly, for war, for terrorism. Along with all kinds of talks about, well, there'll be safety controls and vetting and super vetting and ID cards and databases and so on. So there has been really a ratcheting of the security state and a criminalizing of immigrants on a whole new level. And it is laying the basis for more war and more suffering and more extreme acts. And we do have to think how we respond to this in the days ahead. Now, that's not the discussion for tonight. Sometimes it's important to look at where we're at and then figure out what we can do. But we should take note that there was no such thing as ISIS, the Islamic State, or the al-Nusra Front before the U.S. and French and the European Union, the EU, began their offensive to turn back the clock in the entire region, to absolutely destroy the entire region, to destroy the progressive, modern Arab states that existed, and to break it through secular wars that created terrible division. They wanted to get rid of the Arab nationalist regimes that came out of the anti-colonial struggle after World War II, and that really were able to make great gains in the 1960s and 70s. why would we be thinking how important it is to act? Because the only way to respond to these attacks is with a stronger movement against war and against racism and against imperialism. And to be denouncing imperialism strongly here. So there's another option, another alternative, to show solidarity to oppressed people who are under attack. Now, there was another, if folks have been following the news, attack in Mali today. Is it any surprise? There are now, since the U.S. destruction of Libya, 60 U.S. bases throughout Africa. It's absolutely stunning what the pulling down, the destruction of Libya has done throughout Africa. And where also fighting terrorism becomes the excuse for more U.S. bases and more intervention. Now, how are other U.S. politicians? Is this just Donald Trump? Is this just part of the election? Hillary Clinton today, she called for a no-fly zone and made the most hawkish statement yet on Syria. More so than actually either Republican nor Democratic candidates have done so far. I mean, to call for a no-fly zone in Syria is really to call for all-out war. I mean, it's a direct confrontation with Russia, with Iran, with Hezbollah, and it's setting up a kind of a corridor that's under the domination of the U.S. So you can't get much more extreme or dangerous than that. So that's another, just a breaking news today for us to be aware of. Now, there also are important exposés. What happens when then a crisis hits is even U.S. soldiers who had just been assigned a role never thought of it, never really thought about it. The events force some of them to recalculate. 4 drone operators. 4. I mean, it's one thing when it's one, such as heroic Chelsea Manning. But 4 drone operators gave a press conference where they exposed what the U.S. drone program is. Now that is a heroic, because who knows what they face. We know what whistleblowers against the U.S. military face. And I'm sure they know even more and better. So they gave a press conference where they described the hell and the crimes that they have committed, and the discussion even among the soldiers who sit in front of these computer terminals, where they refer to the targeted assassination, the killing of children, as hitting fun-sized terrorists. I'm not putting you on. This was just came out in this press conference, where they talk about destroying whole units of people who they know nothing about. They don't know who's doing what down there from thousands of feet in the air, as mowing the grass, pulling weeds. It's a dehumanization on such a scale. But it also is important that they're turning their back on it, and it may encourage others to also come forth with exposés. But it does show the horror of U.S. war when here they are branding countries and people as terrorists, and then these drone operators describe what they do day after day in front of these consoles. And their whole countries, there are drones buzzing overhead. They talk about children who, they're never away from the sound of the drones, and it creates terrible fear and trauma. So this is a kind of really racist war and use of terror. Now, it's also important, if we're talking about France, we absolutely have to look at it through the point of view of class politics. 2/3 and more of the French people are against the wars in Africa, the wars in Syria, the bombing in Iraq. And so the terror and the fixation on it and the closing of the border and the new restrictions are really a way to try to force the French population in line by an imperialist government. By an imperialist government which also, even their own population, now about 12 to 15% of the French population are of African and Arab and Muslim background. It's a significant portion, and they're born and raised in France. They're French citizens. This is not counting immigrants who are coming in now. And there's a war against these people who are, or even though they're French citizens, but they are of immigrant background, 2, sometimes 3, sometimes 4 generations ago, where it's the worst housing. The prison population is 80%. They are 12 to 15% of the population, but 80% of the prison population is African and Arab, 70% Muslim. So it just shows to show everything that we know of in U.S. prisons. Isn't this a picture of imperialism here and the war at home? It's almost the exact same proportion. Although U.S. prisons are far, far, far larger, the largest in the world by far. I think there are more people in prison in California than in all of Europe, East and West. So the prison population here is huge, but the French use the same model. And now they're on an offensive to strengthen the hand of the state, and it's an ideological offensive. Now, it's also important, as Sahai raised, how about all the other murders that aren't mourned, aren't mentioned? A bombing in Beirut, a U.S. bombing of a hospital in Afghanistan. We could go on and on, there have been so many. But it doesn't transfix the whole world, because it's the corporate media who decides who is highlighted. Where on Facebook you could put a French flag on your face. It was just suddenly they made a little icon. So everyone would identify with the people in France who died. They wouldn't think, of course, of putting a Lebanese flag, has a nice green tree, or an Afghan, a cedar.
Even a Russian.
A Russian, right. There was a Russian plane destroyed.
Right.
More people died, but they certainly wouldn't put a Russian flag. Now, of course, they want to blame Syria for the attack, but in point of fact, those who carried out this act were French and Belgian citizens. Now, they're not going to go bomb Belgium. Right, it would be...
Don't be sure.
It would be not even a point to be taken seriously. So you see, it's really who's targeted and how the whole discussion gets totally distorted. Now, there's also this whole impression that in France, there's freedom of speech and freedom of press, and it's a very democratic country, right? That's what's said constantly. And now French democracy is under attack, just like democracy in the U.S. Let's look at that. It's true, there's no shutdown of racist, anti-immigrant demonstrations and rallies, or of Le Pen. But you know, when Israel was bombing Gaza, if you even posted on Facebook or anywhere on the internet, even mention of a demonstration in solidarity with Palestine, it was punishable by a year in jail. A year in jail, in France. The only country to bar all demonstrations and protests. There was also a €15,000 euro fine. So it goes to show this is how they pay respect to freedom of speech. It's a complete double standard. Who has freedom of speech? Who has freedom of the press? Who can speak? Who can organize? Who can have a demonstration? The right wing can have a demonstration, have a racist rally, publish racist publications such as Charlie Hebdo. But an anti-racist publication or a publication in solidarity with Palestine, no, absolutely not. Shut it down. So national oppression and racism here or there can never be ignored. It's absolutely the climate, the fabric, the poison that is in the air at every moment. And it is up to us to both call it out, expose it, mobilize against it, organize. This is really our task in the period ahead. Now, I want to, how much time do I have? Well, nobody's timing me. I'll just go right on ahead. That's dangerous. No, I'm sorry. I want to talk about, because we really want to have a discussion tonight, and there's several folks here who have comments prepared. But now the U.S. has claimed that they've been bombing ISIS in Syria for over a year, right? And that's what they claim. Now, it was interesting. Putin, at the G20 meeting, actually called them out on this. Had a meeting with President Obama, and then he had a press conference. And he had some very interesting photos, even in his hand, and some very interesting testimony. He said, this is a quote, "I've shown our colleagues here photos taken from space and from aircraft that clearly demonstrate the scale of the illegal trade in oil that ISIS conducts." He said that they're motorcades of refueling vehicles, these are these huge tankers, that stretch for dozens of kilometers, so that from a height of 4,000 and 5,000 meters, they stretch beyond the horizon. He said they look like oil pipelines. It's so many vehicles, sometimes 1,000 vehicles at a time, in a line. They can be seen by anyone. He also said, here's a backup. The financing of ISIS units. The money comes from 40 countries, and some of them are G20 members who are sitting right here. Whoa. So it was pretty open, and then actually later other Russian, I think like the Secretary of State, were even more pointed in their evidence and their information. So finally, after this public call, the very next day, Monday morning, was the first time that the U.S. got around to bombing the ISIS tankers. And they chose a place where it stretched 296 tankers. I mean, you can imagine, this really stretches on and on. And they bombed 112 of them, so about a third. Now, how did they do it? It was very interesting, the description in the New York Times. They first dropped leaflets to warn the drivers and other people. And then they came back and dropped leaflets again. They didn't want casualties. And then they flew overhead a few times doing firing but not hitting anybody so people could run away. And then they came back and destroyed the trucks. Now, even if we were to assume that these were entirely civilian truck drivers, a year ago they could have shut down this entire operation just by announcing any trucks on the road by next week won't survive. But of course, nothing like that has been done. And not only that, of course, in Turkey, all these trucks, one after the other, cross the border. So much for closing the border. That's something Turkey has never done. And they're also able to both get gas and go back across the border, take out the oil that they've brought, get paid, goes into bank accounts. I say this because we know for years, in terms of the sanctions on Iraq, just how hard the strangulation can be, where nothing crosses a border. Nothing, including food and medicine and pencils for kids, let alone supplies on this scale. Now, at the same time, the U.S. and the French both exchanged coordinates and bombed Raqqa, which is sort of the capital city now of ISIS. Well, what did they hit in Raqqa? They bombed a soccer stadium, hospital, a museum, some government buildings. And you know what? They didn't drop leaflets first. They didn't give out a warning. The cynicism, the level of corruption, and just the level of sheer brutality in the way this war is fought, and the covering. Now, it's been in a lot of coverage for a long time, just how partial the U.S. and all the imperialists are to ISIS, while saying what terrible terrorists they are and how it's breaking up the entire region, how bloody, and talking about burning people alive and decapitating them and all the crimes, and used to justify. But they're major journalists who've written lengthy articles pretty closely detailing. Patrick Coburn wrote one called The Rise of the Islamic State. He was pretty detailed about it. Seymour Hersh, who's quite a credible guy, talked about redirection, and it was U.S. strategy to use Sunni extremists in both Iraq and in Syria. So it's important to know that this isn't a mysterious force. They don't know where it came from. They don't know how it operates. They don't know what it's doing. It's playing a very important role for imperialism. That doesn't mean that it's always imperialist aims and directions. All kinds of things, what they call blowback, can get out of hand from what they expect. They talk about ISIS coming out of and being born in the prisons that the U.S. operated in Iraq. And why was that? Because everyone was divided by religion in ways that they never had been. And hatred of other groups was fomented in the worst ways when people were tortured. And that was an article in The Guardian. So anyway, I could go on, and I really want time for there to be a discussion tonight. There have been other articles. Okay, I've spoken 15 minutes, so I will wind up. Another article was that Turkey could so easily cut off the Islamic State's supply lines, and why doesn't it? Of course, Turkey is a major U.S. partner in this. Saudi Arabia, of course, could stop the funding and the financing. Why don't they? So we shouldn't give just an ounce of credibility in any of this. It's really a way of destroying secular political resistance across the Middle East and destroying governments that had made real accomplishments. When we say it's part of recolonizing Africa, not only North Africa, all of Africa, and all of the Arab world, it's taking place in a very bloody way. And it's taking place whipping up racist demonology right here at home. These very same forces come back home along with the contractors and the private forces, and they join New York City Police Department and a lot of other police departments. And that experience, that being told you have the right to kill again and again, it comes back on New York City and the streets of across the country. And the one sign of real resistance to this in this period for the past year has been the Black Lives Matter movement of refusing to accept what are nonstop killings. our whole approach is going to be, how do we extend solidarity to those who are under attack, and how do we build a culture of consciously resisting a racist climate? So I hope that's what we can both discuss, that's what we do in the days ahead, and that in looking at this war, who created it, what it's doing, what impact it will have, and just how much more serious it's becoming. These are the things that we have to grapple with. Thank you. First, just while I remember it, because we have the whole bus going to Day of Mourning next Thursday, and also it's a 4-day kind of weekend, there is not a Workers' World Branch meeting next Friday, just so we kind of all register that. And I'm also raising it because this is a time of crises, and we have to find ways of being in touch with each other and able to respond in the period ahead. So everyone here tonight and those who are on the phone, please keep that in mind, and especially during the holiday time, that it's often a time when there are offensives by the ruling class. I wanted to pick up on a point that Monica made about at the University of Illinois, this so-called white student union that suddenly put out a denouncement of the Black Lives Matter movement on campus as black terrorists. Now, it means that they immediately caught on the climate, the media. They didn't think that up on their own. It was pounded into their head. But it's important that the Black Lives Matter movement didn't take it for a minute. They went on a war against this group. I mean, they really did, and rightfully so. And they demanded not only the university take action, but that Facebook take action, that they take down their site, and a whole series of things, that the students should be brought up on charges, that this had nothing to do with freedom of speech, that this was really terrorism against black students. So it does show that real lessons are being learned. I mean, these students were combative. Boy, they said, oh yeah? Okay. And they really took them on. And it does show what is happening on the campuses, that there is this new mood. You could really feel it at the University of Missouri, where, right down to the entire football team, taking on racism on the that's absolutely part of the college experience, and students just refusing to accept that is so important. But they've also learned tactics. I think those are the main things. By the way, it is when a crisis like this happens, it revives history, and history that they want to sweep under the rug. So the massacre that took place in Paris of the Algerians back in 1961, it was a real massacre. I mean, several hundred people died, and it didn't come out until years and years, for about 40 years later, the actual 30 years later. I think it was early 90s when this was finally exposed. The role of the fascist police, he had literally been part of the Nazi infrastructure, the French occupation. So, the Vichy state, right, exactly. So, it's important. But I was asked to comment on this, so let me not forget it, because this demonstration being canceled that was going to be huge. I mean, there are all kinds of groups coming from all over the world during the climate meeting. So the climate meeting goes on, but the voice from outside of the people, that is what's canceled. And the organizers of it overwhelmingly accepted that. And even from the U.S., there were people who were going, oh, well, we understand it can't possibly happen in an atmosphere like this. No, that's absolutely not true. And our whole heritage, our experience has been, that's a time to resist. And you will draw to you everyone else who wants to fight. Now, right after September 11th, here in there was going to be a huge demonstration in Washington, D.C. It was scheduled, I think, for September 26th. Was that the date? 29th. Okay. Anti-globalization against the meeting of the IMF and the World Bank. And the organizers of that demonstration canceled it. They said, well, in the face of this terrible catastrophe, we can't possibly have it. And our response was to say, no, absolutely, we will. And that was really the birth of the Answer Coalition, which was shaped and formed, initiated by Workers' World Party. And we're very proud of that, of the role that we played in refusing to both back down, to take it head on, and to say it's a different agenda, though. It's not the IMF and the World Bank. I think, did they even cancel their meeting? I think they did. We said, no, we're going to go ahead with this demonstration against war and racism. And that was both how it was named, how we went forward with it, and 25,000 people turned out. It was a tremendous show of force, and it kind of reignited. And those who said, we can't do this, we have to go into national mourning and all that kind of stuff that you hear at a time like this. No, that's when it's most needed. So I raise that. It's not. Nothing is ever like a holiday time. We don't, although we, of course, have to take breaks. But for everyone in the coming days, let's stay really in tune, in touch. We're going to be in consultation, and we're going to be figuring this out. But the first step is to figure it out politically, to combat it, to denounce it, to expose it, and to know what a danger it is for the entire working class.